Okay, we'll probably wait just a minute here to see if we have some more folks show up here. We're a little bit limited today, or right at this point.
Yes, and I did mention this to Mark. Katie will be calling in remotely. We won't be able to see her, but she is on the road and will be using her phone to call in. So if we have any questions for them, I'm messaging with her, and she will be online, but
And I know that Troy was going to be late if he gets on at all, and Stacy is not available for this one.
correct. Oh, there's Katie.
Okay, and before we start, was there anything opening that Olivia, you needed at this point?
No, for those who were not in this morning's group, though this may have a little bit of overlap for you, I am asking about some of the DHS disqualifications and the collateral consequences of those. I sent a note to the Legislative Coordinating Commission for those and have not yet received a response. Just know that I will send that out from them as soon as I get it.
And Angie, did you have anything before I turn this over to Representative Moeller, who I expect to do the intro here?
Nope, I don't. Thanks.
Okay, Representative Moeller, are you available?
Ah, there she is.
Hello, I'm here. Sorry, I'm trying to deal with an audio issue here.
Okay, so to start this out, because Teresa is here from Hennepin, did you want to give an intro to what she's going to provide to the subgroup here on crimes?
I don't have a formal interview. Can you hear me okay? My
Yes.
external mic isn't working. Okay, great. But I will just say that Teresa is an extremely experienced prosecutor at the Hennepin County Attorney's Office. She handles juvenile cases. She is the lead on the sexual assault cases. I can let her give some more details as to what she does and who she is. But I think the information that she has for our group today is going to be very helpful, and I'm really glad that she could join us.
And just before she starts, Mark, I just wanted to say, if for anyone who doesn't realize this, she's talking about juvenile, particularly EJJ issues and adult prosecution kinds of issues, because in the event that we recommend limiting juvenile registration in that way, then we have a better idea kind of how those things work from a practical standpoint.
Okay. Can we hand this over to you, Teresa? Just
Yes.
tell us everything.
All right, thank you. And I hope my focus is okay. I wasn't planning to talk a lot about EJJ. I was just going to talk generally about juveniles and sex offender registration, but I trust that people will jump in and ask me questions as needed. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you today about, at least about my perspective on predatory offender registration for juveniles. As Kelly said, my name is Terry Frelke. I've been a prosecutor for the last 32 years. I spent my first 5 years with the Minneapolis City Attorney's Office doing misdemeanors and gross misdemeanor offenses. And I've been with the Hennepin County Attorney's Office for the last 27 years. Out of those 27, I've prosecuted both adult and juvenile sex offenses. I did adult sex cases for about 4 years, and I've done juvenile sex offenses for about 22 years. For the last 8 years, I've been the supervisor of the juvenile prosecution sex-specific team. And just by way of background about juveniles, so as most of you probably know, juveniles can be charged with a delinquency offense between the ages of 10 and the ages of 17. Between the ages of 14 and 17, they can be charged either as a straight juvenile, and juvenile court jurisdiction goes up until age 19, or they could be charged as an extended jurisdiction juvenile. An extended jurisdiction juvenile, or an EJJ, goes, the jurisdiction goes up till age 21, so it extends it another 2 years. But in addition to a juvenile sentence, those perpetrators also get an adult prison sentence that hangs over their head until they're 21 years old. Those offenders that are between 14 and 17 can also be handled as a certified juvenile, where they get certified to stand trial in adult court. In Hennepin County, the majority of our juvenile sex offenders involve offenses where the juveniles know where the juvenile offender knows their victim. In most of our cases, those offenders are offending against family members. It might be a sibling, a cousin, or they're offending against somebody that they know, a neighbor, a classmate, a family friend. Very few of our juveniles, whether it's straight juvenile, EJJ, certification, are offending against strangers. And very few of our juvenile offenders offend against adults. And just so we're clear on the nomenclature, when when an adult either pleads guilty before trial or is found guilty after trial, they're convicted. When a juvenile pleads guilty before trial or is found guilty after a trial, they're adjudicated delinquent. So for most practical purposes, an adjudication is the same as an adult conviction. In Minnesota, when a juvenile is adjudicated delinquent of a sexual offense, that juvenile is required to register as a predatory offender, just like an adult must do. That predatory offender registration requirement includes most of the common offenses that our juveniles commit: criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, second degree, third degree, fourth degree, possession of child porn, dissemination of child porn. So if a kid's charged with and is adjudicated on any of those offenses, they're going to register as a predatory offender. And they also have to register as a predatory offender if they plead to any offense that arises out of those facts. So if a kid's charged with criminal sexual conduct in the third degree, which is a felony, but they plead guilty to an assault in the fifth degree, which is a misdemeanor assault, not even sex related, they will register if it arises out of the same set of facts. So we cannot skirt that registration requirement if the kid is admitting an offense. We can't just let him plead to a lesser included or let him plead to a different count. The registration requirement still applies. And in most cases, that registration for juveniles is 10 years, but in some situations, it can be a lifetime registration. So I just want to give you a couple scenarios of what we may see here in juvenile court. Let's say two brothers, and I'm going to get graphic here, so I apologize, but I need to lay out kind of what we see in our cases. So let's say there's two brothers. One brother's 11, the other brother's 7, and they're playing together in a bedroom. And the 11-year-old says to the 7-year-old, "Hey, let's play a game." And so the 11-year-old pulls down his own pants. So the 11-year-old's pants are down, and the 11-year-old puts his penis into the mouth of his 7-year-old brother. And then over the course of the next 4 months, or 2 months, let's say 2 months, the 11-year-old does it to his brother 4 more times. On that last time, mom walks in, catches him in the act, and mom reaches out to the pediatrician and she says, I don't know what happened, but here's what went down. And the pediatrician, as a mandated reporter, calls the police, and now the juvenile justice system is in motion. That 11-year-old is chargeable with criminal sexual conduct in the first degree. And he's chargeable under several different subdivisions of that statute. And to give you an idea of how serious that is, if an adult is convicted of criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, the presumptive prison sentence is 144 months. So an adult would go to prison for 12 years if convicted of a criminal sexual conduct in the first degree. So we have an 11-year-old who's chargeable with that. And he's chargeable because in the different scenarios, one is because his brother is under 14 and he's more than 36 months older and there was penetration. So that's a crim sex 1. He's also chargeable because there's a significant relationship. They're brothers and the victim was under 16 and the 11-year-old penetrated him. He's also chargeable under another subdivision because there's a significant relationship. The brother's under 16 and it happened multiple times over an extended period of time. So this 11-year-old is clearly chargeable with a very, very serious offense. And if he admits that offense and is adjudicated delinquent, he will register as a predatory offender for 10 years. And the parents of both the perpetrator and the offender are very torn. You know, they want help for their perpetrator kid, and they also want to ensure that their victim child is safe and is taken care of, and they don't want their perpetrator child to reoffend. And they're thinking, we did the right thing. You know, we called our pediatrician, and now here we are. And our 11-year-old is facing registration as a predatory offender. I think parents just don't want that collateral consequence that comes with that. You know, if somebody makes a bad decision as an 11-year-old and they register, that kid's going to register until he's almost done with college. Will it impact college? Will it impact his first job? Will it impact where he lives? It's just something the parents are thinking about. For me, from a public safety perspective, I want that 11-year-old to take responsibility for what he did. I want him to own what he did to his brother. I want him to enter and successfully complete an appropriate sex offender treatment program. But as a prosecutor in those interfamilial cases, which is a large majority of the cases we handle in juvenile court, I walk a really fine line that's hard to manage. I have these parents that I have to keep on board because I need my victim. If my case doesn't resolve, I need that victim to come in and testify. I need that victim to be cooperative. I need those parents to be cooperative. And if they see me as someone who is being heavy-handed and being too hard on their offending child, and they don't understand, why would you want him to register as a predatory offender? That's not what happened. He was in his bedroom with his brother. It was poor judgment. It was a bad decision, but he's not a predatory offender where he should register for 10 years. So it's a challenging position as a prosecutor to be in when that's a large number of our cases. And I will say in some interfamilial cases where they're not as egregious, and I don't want to offend anybody. Obviously, all sexual assaults are egregious. But if it didn't go on for years, if there wasn't force or coercion, if it wasn't multiple forms of penetration, if there was no injuries, I may try to come up with a creative solution so that I get what I need, where that kid is going to be held accountable and get the treatment he needs. But the family also gets what they need, which is they keep both their children safe. They ensure that their offending child gets the help they need, and that he doesn't register as a predatory offender for the next 10 years into his adulthood. So one of the things that we do sometimes in Hennepin County is we kind of came up with a creative way to handle some of these cases. Juvenile will plead guilty to the offense. He will get assigned a sex-specific probation officer. We'll have a psychosexual evaluation done to find out what kind of treatment this child needs, whether it's residential, whether it's in the community. But we don't go to sentencing. We don't go to disposition. The child starts treatment. The child continues in treatment. Sex offender treatment takes between 12 to 18 months to complete. And so we'll just keep putting out sentencing. We might have that youth come back every 4 to 6 months to see how he's doing. And the probation officer also keeps us updated, but the treatment program will provide us with a report. He's completed 4 out of his 12 assignments. He's participating in group. He's coming to individual therapy. He's abiding by his safety plan. That's great. So we're kind of watching him as we go along. And then once he successfully completes primary treatment, again, which is 12 to 18 months usually down the road, then the state will give him a stay of adjudication. And by giving him a stay of adjudication, he doesn't register as a predatory offender. He's admitted everything, he's gone through primary treatment, but he won't have the registration requirement. And we do that specifically to avoid registration in some of those interfamilial cases. Not all, but in some. And when he receives that stay of adjudication after primary treatment is done, a stay of adjudication can only be for 2 180-day periods. So really for a year. So the youth can be on this stay of adjudication for another year after they've completed primary treatment. And that gives them time to do aftercare. It gives us time to see how the youth does in the community, putting to use everything that he's learned in treatment. It gives us a chance to continue to watch the safety plan, make sure he's not babysitting or having unsupervised contact with, children younger than himself, whatever the safety plan requires. And then at the end of that stay of adjudication, if he's successful, then his case gets dismissed, and he didn't register as a predatory offender. Contrast that with the other kinds of cases that we get. I'll tell you about a kid named Dane. I've changed his name, but the case is accurate. When Dane was 15, he sexually assaulted 2 adult females within about a 3 or 4 week period. In the first case, Dane was in the parking lot of an Aldi grocery store, and he was kind of lying in wait, and a woman came out with her cart. She put it in the cart corral. She's walking back to her cart or to her car, and Dane comes up with a knife and holds it to her and forces her to get into her own car. He makes her drive to a dead end road. He fondles her breasts. He tells her he wants to have sex with her. She's able to escape out of the car, and she goes running. He chases her. He grabs her from behind. He pulls down her pants. He's thrusting against her backside. She's able to get away again. And she runs to a stranger's house, and she's pounding on the door, and a stranger answers and calls the police, and Dane is long gone. About 3 weeks later, Dane is at a park. It's daytime. And he sees an adult woman on a phone. She's just walking in the park talking on her phone. He sneaks up behind her, grabs her from behind in a bear hug, pulls her pants down, and she's fighting him. She's trying to get him off of her. He's hitting her in the face. She's trying to call on her phone, tell the person on the phone what's happening. He's knocking the phone out of her hand. He grabs her on the breast. She's able to get up and run. And he's caught at the scene. And we're able to tie him back to what happened at the Aldi. That's a case where that kid, that 15-year-old kid, should register as a predatory offender. We filed a motion to have him certified to adult court. The parties had a contested hearing about that. We called a psychologist and a probation officer. The defense didn't call any witnesses, and the court denied our motion. The court not only didn't certify him, but she didn't EJJ him. She had the option to also EJJ him. She chose not to. She kept him straight juvenile. The state made a plea offer. We wanted him to plead to 1 felony out of each petition. That is a felony against the victim from Aldi and a felony against the victim from the park. He didn't want to do that. He wanted a stay of adjudication. We weren't willing to offer that. The respondent chose to enter a straight plea. And what that means is we're no longer part of the plea negotiation. The state's no longer part of the plea negotiation. This is now Dane and the judge. And in order to do a straight plea, Dane had to admit to everything. So Dane at 15 pled guilty to 7 felonies. He pled guilty to 5 criminal sexual conduct charges, and he pled guilty to 2 kidnapping charges. And the court gave him a stay of adjudication over our objection for that offense. And remember, that stay of adjudication is only for 1 year. And recently, Dane was unsuccessfully discharged from his treatment program. And we, of course, moved to have that stay of adjudication revoked, and we wanted him adjudicated delinquent on both petitions, and he'll register for a lifetime if he's adjudicated on both. That's the kind of kid that needs to register. So at least from my perspective, I think predatory offender registration is tricky. I think it has so much value as a law enforcement tool. When you register, you all know this, but you're registering where you live and locations where you spend a lot of your time, if it's a cabin or whatever, where you're employed, your vehicles. As a law enforcement tool, I think of examples like, some creepy guy hanging out at a school playground where he's watching the kids and nobody knows who he is. I mean, every time they try to get him, he runs and they can't figure out who he is. But if you look at the registry and you're able to figure out who lives in the neighborhood, that might be helpful. Or if a red car keeps pulling up to children as they're walking to school and offering them rides, and they don't have a plate number, but they have a car description, maybe the registry would help with that. So it's an excellent law enforcement tool. I totally appreciate that. My concern is I wonder if predatory offender registry doesn't cast too big of a net, because all juveniles who are adjudicated have to register. And I think of that 11-year-old. Does it make sense for him to register for 10 years? I'm not aware, and this is just me personally, I'm not aware of an unsolved sexual assault offense that has been solved off the registry where a juvenile was the person that registered. I'm just not aware of that. Maybe it's happened. I just don't know. And the reason I'm skeptical that it's happened is juveniles' recidivism rates are very low as long as they get treatment. So there's a couple of studies out there. Depending on the studies, the juvenile recidivism rate is somewhere between 3 and 13%. And secondly, most juveniles perpetrate on people who know them. So there's no need to really rely on a sex offender registry when the perpetrator is going to perpetrate on a family member, a friend, a classmate, a girlfriend, somebody that they know. And I look at the juvenile justice system, and it's supposed to be, it's supposed to hold kids accountable for sure, but it's also supposed to be really rehabilitative. And if a youth offends when they're 12 or 13, and then they register until they're 22 or 23, as they're entering adulthood, I'm not sure how rehabilitative that is for some of those kids. Having said that, I also take the position that there are some circumstances that I'm in favor of juveniles registering. And I haven't thought through kind of what those scenarios would be, but, I think about, kids being older, maybe 16 or older, or they fall into some kind of aggravated category, like they used a weapon, like a gun or a knife, or they caused injury, or they used force or coercion, or something that's more egregious than an 11-year-old perping on his 7-year-old brother 4 times. And again, don't get me wrong, it's not good behavior, but I'm not sure that's the kind of offender that should be registering. And so as I look at sex offender registry, I'm thinking the juveniles that should register are those juvenile offenders that are where their behavior is more like our adult sex offenders. And that's just kind of my perspective. But so that's all I had. And I would open it for questions. I know it sounded like you were interested in EJJ maybe, and so I'm happy to answer any questions about that. Angela?
Yes, so that's kind of one of my main questions, and what I hope you could maybe shed some light on is, like, let's say this committee decides to recommend that juvenile registration is not eliminated altogether, but that it applies either, like you said, maybe to a certain age offender or older, or what if the recommendation were related to only juveniles who were EJJ or certified as an adult? Does that do anything to, from your standpoint, to address the people who should be registered? Does the EJJ adult prosecution kind of cut off help with that kind of separation, or not really? As far as separating out the more serious offenders.
Yeah, I absolutely think that would help a lot. And I do think all EJJ kids and all certified kids should register. No doubt in my mind on that. And it would eliminate that, because for EJJ and certification, that's not, for the most part, that isn't something the state can just designate. We can in a small group of cases, but I don't know if you want me to explain kind of how we EJJ and certify kids.
I think that would be awesome, because that's kind of what we're trying to get at, is so people here, all of us lay people, understand like what goes into that decision.
Yeah, so we have our own internal guidelines on when we should move to EJJ or certify. But aside from that, like I said, it's kids 14 to 17 can be EJJ or certified. And there are 6 public safety factors that a court must look at to determine whether or not a kid should be EJJ or certified. And those public safety factors are, the first one is the seriousness of the offense. And so the court looks like, when I said like that criminal sexual conduct in the first degree, where if you were an adult, you'd go to prison for 144 months. That would fall in the very serious category. And if I was moving for EJJ, that factor would weigh in favor of EJJ. Regardless of anything else, that factor would. And some of the, I would say most often, that factor weighs in favor of EJJ or certification, because that's really where we are starting as prosecutors to look at. We're looking at the offense itself. The second factor is culpability. And so if this juvenile is the only perpetrator, he's going to be fully culpable. And that factor will also weigh in favor of certification or EJJ. If, for example, though, this wasn't a sex offense, and let's say it was an aggravated robbery, and this guy was the getaway driver, so maybe not as culpable as the guy that went into the bank with the gun, the court looks at that. So in a sex offense, we do get some where there's multiple people perpetrating at the same time. And so maybe somebody's less culpable, but usually that factor is also going to weigh in favor of EJJ or certification. And then the third factor, you're going to make me remember all these, is prior history. So your prior delinquency history. So, and typically it involves adjudicated offenses. So if someone comes in and has no prior offenses, that factor is probably going to weigh in favor of not EJJing them or not certifying them. Because they want to see if there's a pattern. Is this the first time we're seeing this kid, or has he been in court multiple times and, isn't catching on? Even if they're not sex offenses, they could be thefts, they could be disorderly conducts, they could be anything, but just, is he involved in the system? And how does that factor line up? Do we think that should weigh in favor of EJJ or certification or not? And then there's how they did in treatment is the next factor. And that's, if a kid has been involved in the system before and he's been ordered to either a placement or ordered to do therapy or something in the community, did he successfully complete it? Did he do what he was supposed to do? Did he show up for his appointments? Did he do the assignments that were required? And they look at that factor. And then the E and F factors, the last 2 factors are kind of looked at in concert. And that is the consequence in juvenile court sufficient to address the behavior? And then F is, or the very final factor is, are there programs that are available to this child? And it's a little challenging in EJJ cases because the E factor, are there programs available in the juvenile system? There's always going to be programs available in the juvenile system because Red Wing will take anybody that we send there. That one's kind of a hard one, unless the youth has already been to Red Wing, then that helps us. But the court has to go through those factors to determine whether or not a youth should be EJJ'd or certified. So there's a lot of stopgaps in there to ensure that only our most serious offenders are being EJJ'd or certified. There is one situation where the state can simply designate someone as EJJ, and that is if someone is eligible to be, if a kid is 16 or over and commits an offense where he would go to prison if he were an adult. So that example of criminal sexual conduct in the first degree where he'd go to prison for 144 months. If a 16-year-old committed that offense, we could either file a presumptive certification motion where it's presumed that he's going to be certified, and the burden is on him to convince the court not to certify him. In those situations, we can either go through a presumptive certification process, or we can just designate the child as EJJ. At the end of the day, a kid who's we move to have certified under presumptive certification, the only thing that he can be, the least that could happen to him is EJJ. If we do a presumptive certification motion and the court doesn't agree with that, the most the court can do is EJJ him. They can't send him back to straight juvenile. So he has to be EJJ'd. I know that's very confusing. And Angela, I see your hand is up again.
Well, so I'm thinking of this guy that you talked about, that you said he should have to register and you tried to get him certified. Was that a presumptive certification case or not?
That was a non-presumptive because he was 15.
Oh,
So
okay.
it was his age. So if he was 16, then the court would have either had to certify him or EJJ him and would have had no other option. He was 15.
And you look at the same factors for EJJ and certification?
Yes.
So
Yep.
how is it decided which of those you would ask for? Like, when would you ask for certification versus EJJ?
We talk about it in the office. I mean, we have internal guidelines that we use kind of as a starting point. So if an attorney's gonna charge a case and they're thinking that when they look at our internal guidelines and they see that our internal guidelines recommend that we certify him, that attorney will go to their supervisor and will say, here's what I have. I'm thinking about certifying him. Are we good? And we talk about it. Recently, we've decided that we may try to put together a committee. It's hard with COVID because we're all remote, but do it more as a committee thing. The problem is it's got to be a pretty quick decision. We have 10 days after we file the petition to file that motion. And so we'd have to get a group together pretty quick to evaluate that information. But I will also add that when we make that motion for certification or EJJ, what the court will do is order two things. They'll order probation to do an EJJ or a certification study, and they'll order psychological services to do a psychological evaluation. And in the case of sex offenses, it's a psychosexual evaluation. And so when the court is making that determination of certification in EJJ, they have the benefit of very thorough reports from the probation officer and the psychologist. And in sex cases, it'll go through things like, I mean, you'll get a lot of sociological information, like, you know, how the kid does in school, whether he's moved 8 million times, if he has a 2-parent family, if there's been child protection involvement with the family before, you know, so you'll get kind of a picture of who the kid is. And then the probation officer will also find out about that history, that delinquency history. And so we generally don't look nationwide. we just look in Minsus and we find out what he's got in Minnesota. But the probation officer will. They'll find out, you know, he came from Chicago, he's got some offenses there, he's got offenses here. And so they'll put all that together. And then the probation department will make a recommendation, going through all those 6 factors on what probation thinks should happen. Should he be certified or should he be EJJ'd? The psychologist in a sex case will go through things like sex history, whether they watch pornography, and how much they watch it, whether they've been victims themselves, and just kind of get a sexual history about the kid. The psychologist does not go through the factors. I think that might be unique to Hennepin County. I'm guessing that in other counties, the psychologist will go through those 6 factors. Our psychologist used to, and probably about, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, maybe not that long ago, they decided not to go through the factors. They thought they didn't feel, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I don't think they felt qualified on those E and F factors, the ones that talk about placement options and things. I think they were thinking, we don't go visit those programs. We can't tell you if they're good or bad. We can't tell you if the kid's going to get the right treatment at those programs. So they backed off giving an opinion on whether a kid should be certified or EJJ. And in order to give that opinion, you have to go through the 6 factors that's set out in the statute. Anyone who gives an opinion has to go through those 6 factors. So instead, the psychologists just gather the information and provide it to the court and to the parties, but don't make a recommendation one way or the other. But by the time we get to a certification or an EJJ hearing, we've got a lot of information by that point about the youth, about their prior offending behavior, about what their growing up history's been like. And so we just have a lot of information by that point.
In your experience, how often when you ask for EJJ or adult certification as a prosecutor, how often does the court grant it percentage-wise? And I know you don't have exact numbers, but I'm just curious.
I could have gotten exact numbers because my office loves to put stuff like that together. I don't know it off the top of my head. I will say probably not as often as we'd like. You know, it kind of depends on the bench that we have at any particular time. But I think it's been more challenging in the last couple of years to get certification in EJJ in some of our cases.
So I mean, would you say like 50%, 75%, 25%? I'm just ballparking.
Maybe 50%. Yeah. And in some cases, like I said, on those presumptive certification motions, they either have to give us certification or EJJ. They can't give us straight juvenile. Yeah. But on an EJJ case, they could give us straight juvenile. Or on a non-presumptive certification, they could give us EJJ or they could give us straight juvenile. So so they have a lot of options. And even when probation is recommending, you know, certification or EJJ, the court doesn't always go along with it. So, and I could be way off on my 50%. I can find out and let Representative Mueller know and let so she can let the rest of you know. But
well, we have somebody from court in this committee, and she just sent a message in the chat that that's something she can pull. So
excellent. Okay.
So we'll let her do the hard work because she loves that. That'd be great, Karen, if you can do that.
Katrina.
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks, Terry. I appreciate the detailed explanation and really appreciate explaining EJJ. I know those presumptive commits get confusing to folks that aren't in the weeds about these cases. So I really appreciate the explanation. Can you speak to some of the disparity numbers that we see in EJJ and certification specifically?
Yeah, I probably can. I'm not an expert in that. I know it's something we're looking at. I can probably just tell you anecdotally my thoughts on it. There certainly is racial disparity in what happens in those in the in what kids get certified and what kids get EJJ'd. And all I can say about that is because of the factors, so much of those things are kind of already predetermined before we make the motion. So even if you have kids that maybe commit the same offense, so their factor A, their seriousness of the offense, and factor B, their culpability might be the same. Sometimes when you get to factor C and D, that's when kids of color, I think, might end up, that might be where the disparities come in. Because sometimes the kids of color, either because of socioeconomic issues or because of other problems that they had when they were growing up, they may have more of a delinquency history, so that will weigh against them, or they'll have had opportunities for therapy or treatment and they didn't make it there. Sometimes it's not even on them. It's just, they have a mom who's trying to work full-time, 2 jobs, and manage her 3 kids, and she can't get them to treatment or therapy. And so he doesn't successfully complete it. So I think that's where some of the disparities kind of are illuminated in those factors C and D, the prior record of delinquency and the treatment part. Because I think some of those kids of color, because maybe of some socioeconomic issues that they had growing up, they weren't given the same opportunities that maybe some other kids were. And again, that's just anecdotally. My office has reports and things on that, so I apologize that I don't know that information off the top of my head as far as specifics, but that's what I would say.
But that would be great to get those reports. And
Okay.
if Representative Moeller, if you're willing to gather them and send them to Olivia and myself, that would be great. And then we could do the distribution.
And Representative Moeller, I can get those to you. Okay.
Katrina.
No, I was just actually going to say exactly what you said, Mark. It would be helpful to get those. I just really appreciate it. Terry, I think, your office has been doing a lot of intentional work specifically around EJJ and certification. And so just really appreciate the work on that, but just really appreciate you really going into those factors, because I think that's really helpful in understanding how disparities can potentially build on each other as we go through this. And so as we're talking about predatory offender registration and the long-term consequences of that, I think it's, it behooves us and it's our duty to really understand the disparities and how those impact the long-term consequences of kids. And when we have disparities that build upon each other, we have to be really intentional about that. And I know your office has been doing that. And so I just really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And Janine.
I really appreciate your creativity. Please tell your colleagues thanks for trying to figure out systems around systems in an appropriate way, not in a bad way. I'm curious if you have any take, Terry, on how other counties do it. Are other counties finding a work group that sort of decides like your internal guidelines or some kind of internal processes? And maybe you don't know, but I am curious across the state how other folks might be doing it or approaching it.
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know how other states or how other counties are going about making those determinations, but yeah, I can't even speak. I wouldn't even know if maybe they're not filing them as much as we do or as frequently as we do. And I don't know if but when a juvenile is either handled as a straight juvenile or as an EJJ, they are returned to their county of residence for disposition. So, so we do sometimes see kids who, you know, were prosecuted by Ramsey County and then they come back to us for disposition. And I will say that there are times when a case, a sex case in particular, will come to us for disposition. And our first reaction is, why wasn't this kid certified? So I do think there's probably a difference among counties on how they do things and why they do things.
Jim,
I've practiced in my 34 years. I've practiced in Greater Minnesota, also practiced in the Metro. And I could tell you that, I mean, each county that I've ever practiced in has its own culture. You know, I mean, the case that you brought up with Dane, the kid that
Yeah.
you brought up, I would say that kid would have been certified in almost any other county that I practice in, certainly in Greater Minnesota. I would say with some confidence that he would have been probably certified here in Ramsey, given what I know about the judges in that particular case. So I know that, like in Greater Minnesota, I could tell you the workaround you guys have done, which I think is very creative. I've heard it before. And it takes some patience. I know that in other jurisdictions, judges won't let those workarounds like that because of the timelines. They'll shut those down. And then of course you're looking at, you're up against that year's time frame and you don't get, the kid ends up having to be certified. So sometimes I think we look at like our metro counties and our Greater Minnesota counties and think that what goes on in each of those places are one and the same, and it's not. And I said, each county presents its own set of issues. And when I say culturally, I mean, you could have a kid in a Greater Minnesota county, but who's offended, but who's sort of part of the county structure in the community, and then all of a sudden see the system bending over backwards because everybody believes that that kid's a good kid, where the kid that nobody knows or doesn't have any particular contact with will be certified or EJJ'd much quicker. So, I mean, and I really appreciate the way you explained it. I think it's, there are factors in every case. I mean, there's cases that you've got certifications on that you absolutely should have, and other cases where you don't. And sometimes it just depends on the nature of the advocacy coming from the other side and the judge that they pull. I do appreciate it. And I think what my point was is that throughout the state, it really varies for the most part. It's more conservative in Greater Minnesota with, the more serious the charge. The other thing I would explain, or at least ask, there's a provision in criminal sexual conduct in the 3rd degree and 4th degree that's specifically juvenile specific, subdivision 1A. And how many of those cases, and when I say juvenile specific, is only a juvenile can be charged? And how many of those cases do you handle, if you know?
I don't know, but probably not that many. And they just redid all those statutes effective September 15th. And so now they have them all renumbered. But we do. I mean, and for those of you that aren't familiar with the statutes, criminal sexual conduct in the 1st and 3rd degree are penetration, 2nd and 4th degree are contact. And in each of those, it's all based on the age of the offender, the age of the victim, and the age difference between them. And so, you know, so Jim, to your question, I'd have to go and look at our stats to see how many of those we charge, but you know, every time we get a new case in, you have to go to those statutes and figure out, where does my kid fit? You know, it's penetration, so I know it's 1 or 3, and where do they fit in the age difference and in the behavior. So I can find that out though, if you want. Okay. I appreciate everything that you were saying. When you mentioned the timelines, so in juvenile court, after a kid pleads, if they're out of custody, they are supposed to go to sentencing within 45 days. And obviously, and if they're in custody, 15 days. Obviously, we're not doing that in those cases where we are, you know, putting off disposition and getting the kid through treatment. And we haven't run into any issues because it's all by agreement. I mean, the defense wants this as well because they don't want their youth to register either. But I could see down the road if something happened and some kid ended up violating, a defense counsel coming back and saying, we shouldn't have done this in the first place. My kid was supposed to have a disposition in 45 days and the court didn't do it. And so this wasn't even a valid sentence in the first place. So those timelines they're tricky, and we kind of skirt around them. And Jim, the other thing on your point about if the Dane case would have happened in outstate Minnesota, judges may have certified him or would have likely have certified him. This is my own personal bias, but I think that was a judge-based decision in our county. The judge had no intention of certifying that kid or EJJing him or adjudicating him delinquent or anything. So that was strictly a judge-based, I guess, bias on what she thought about that kid. So I don't know that she necessarily followed the law and what was required on EJJ and certification.
Do we have any other questions from anybody? Patty, I knew you were going to say.
Well, I am sorry. I worked for the health department in sexual violence prevention, and a big current growing field of study is on brain development and that prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making process. And they know now it's not fully developed till like age 25. So I really struggle with trying children as adults and viewing children's behavior the same as the adult behavior. And I don't know how to get past that. Everything inside of me wants these kids to get a chance to turn their lives around. And we know that statistically they do. So I appreciate your creative options, but I just keep thinking there used to be a juvenile justice system that was really honoring the difference between juveniles and adults. And sometimes, especially with sexual crimes, it gets really muddy. And as you shared individual cases, I lived in St. Paul when I was doing that and met this aunt of these 2 boys who exactly the first case you described. They were having oral sex with a younger brother when dad walks in, and they got 7 years prison time. 7. They met other kids who were in prison for murder who got less time than they got. And it's just like they're children. It was stupid. It was everything was going against these kids. And at that point they were almost suicidal in this wherever they were. So she was asking for help. And I'm like, it's messy.
Yeah.
With kids, they are children and they make really stupid decisions. How many of us didn't make stupid decisions when we were 14 and 15? And I just really want to keep being that voice of that we can't judge them as same. We can't call them juvenile perpetrators. They're children with problematic sexual behavior, and they have to be held accountable. The behavior has to stop, and they have to get the help that they need to turn it around. And as you said, so often they're born into a situation that is not conducive to healthy relationships, and now we're punishing them for them doing everything that they've lived with all their lives. And I just gonna keep always bringing that up. They're not the same as adults, and whatever we can do at this and on this committee level to change that. I'm sickened, and I didn't know that we on the books say that 10-year-olds can be registered. 10. Yeah, and that shouldn't be on. That's one of the most extreme of all the 50 states, and I don't understand why we have that. And I personally think that juveniles shouldn't be on a registry, possibly for law enforcement, because I do support law enforcement and investigation, that there could be a separate system or something, but they're not the same as when they get older, or they commit another crime, that changes things. But being charged as a juvenile and maybe not even convicted, but then later being charged for robbing a convenience store, and now they're sex offenders, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's just, it makes no sense. I'm a highly logical person. I'm really struggling with any logic behind this. So thank you for really kind of clearing up. I didn't understand the language. And I often just don't quite get, what are we trying to do here? Is it rehabilitative? Are we holding these kids accountable, or are we preventing parents from coming forward and getting their children help because of the consequences to it? So I just had to, that brain research is really important. And I don't hear that in any of the, that's the public health approach. I don't hear that in the criminal justice approach enough. So I just wanted to share. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And I will just make a plug for one other thing we do in Hennepin, and that is we have an alternative program for some of our youngest sex offenders between the ages of 10 to 13. It started out in 2010. We started this program. And it used to be 10 to 12-year-olds, and now we made it 10 to 13-year-olds. And it's not every 10 to 13-year-old, but that example I gave you of the 11-year-old and the 7-year-old, that kid would have gone into that program. It's called a preteen intervention program for alleged sexual offending. And it's not even as part of the delinquency system. When we send a kid to that program, it's not supervised by probation or anything. They're supervised by child welfare workers, social workers. And those social workers get them a psychosexual. The social workers make sure they get to treatment. The social workers do the safety plan. Social workers do aftercare. And it's been just a highly successful program that we've kept a lot of those younger offenders, because I'm right there with you, Patty, about brain development. We've kept a lot of those offenders not even into the juvenile system. Those cases come into our office and they automatically, they go to that program and they never even see a courtroom. So I'm with you.
Anything else here? Angie.
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank Teresa for all of her time today.
I'm sorry I took up so much of your time. I think I was
Oh,
only supposed to be
no,
on the
I'm
agenda
sorry.
for a half hour.
Sorry, we kept you a little longer than I think you expected, but it's been very helpful.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. And those reports, we'll get those and share.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And if there's other things that come up that you want to ask Representative Moeller, I can certainly get back to her on anything else that you might have questions on or want me to follow up on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Now where do we go?
Well, the other thing that I had is Sheriff Heck had put together some possible language on taking false imprisonment out of the same set of circumstances. And he sent that to the chairs and to Mark and Olivia. And I just asked, I was gonna see if Mark could maybe screen
Yeah.
share that to show you at least some initial language that would do that, we think. So people can just see how that's worded. It's nothing too profound, really. It just moves it to a separate paragraph.
Okay. Yeah, and I broke it into slides so that it's a little, stands a little bit alone. So.
Of course you did.
Do you see that now? False imprisonment?
But no, we were just gonna do the first one of his attachments, so.
Oh, nope, that's fine. This is just the current law so that people
Oh, okay.
see what it currently says. Yep.
Well, he rewrote false imprisonment, and then after we talked about it at our meetings last week, we decided it might make more sense to just rewrite the registration part of it and take false imprisonment out of the same set of circumstances. So I don't think the rewriting of false imprisonment is still, we thought the better way would be to deal with it in 243-166.
Okay, so here's the one he talked about, rewriting it to just make it connected to registration. And then this
Right.
was the exclusion of domestic assault. This was actually a variation on that excluded the sexual crimes. But if you wanted to go to this, the registration required, is that the one you wanted?
Yeah, it was the first attachment of the email we got this morning.
Do you see that now? Registration required?
Yeah, although the version we got had the whole,
Here.
I think you could just screen share his document, but
Yeah.
it's the first attachment.
The first, as in describing crime included, which was his first attachment.
Okay, sorry. Let me get into my emails if I can find it here. Okay, so his email today, it was, yes, describing crime included. That was the one that he rewrote after we talked about, oh wait, no, that's not it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's what was
Sorry. Oh,
throwing me off a bit.
no wonder, because I told you first attachment. It would be the third attachment.
So removing false imprisonment from same set of circumstances?
Yeah, but it includes more than just that. So it's the third, yeah, okay.
Registration required. I can.
So did you just took the stuff he changed out of the whole thing that he submitted?
Yeah.
Is that what this is?
Yep. And what I did was
because I think it makes more sense to look at the document if that's
Okay.
something that can be shared, just because you can see the context of it.
Yep, we can do that.
Sorry. High maintenance.
So we will do that. Let me zoom in a bit. Okay, do you see that screen?
Yeah, can that zoom any further, or is that the best we can do size wise?
You want to, yeah.
I don't know if other people, can you see it, or is it looking pretty small to you? Oh, there, much better. Okay, so this is what Troy put together, and what this language does is he took false imprisonment, and I don't know, Mark, if you can scroll down. So he took false imprisonment out of paragraph 2 and added a paragraph 3. And then the paragraph 3 requires a conviction for false imprisonment and takes it out of the same set of circumstances list. So that is just an example of what might accomplish, if that's something this group wanted to recommend, accomplish taking the same set of circumstances out for false imprisonment charges. And it would only be registration for a conviction of false imprisonment with this language. Does anyone have any comments or concerns about that?
I think one of the concerns that has been raised was that issue of it. It still brings in non-sexual issues.
Right,
yeah,
but I mean, it gets rid of a lot of them for sure. Go ahead.
that was going to be my point, just that, yeah, even if it requires a conviction for false imprisonment, it can still be non-sexual crimes. And I thought the main goal was kind of the kidnapping and false imprisonment, specifically non-sex related, not sexually motivated. We want to avoid registration on those, whether it's domestic, drug related, any other reason not sexually motivated. And I thought
I don't think that was necessarily true for the kidnapping though. But
well, I mean, if it's sexually motivated kidnapping and or false imprisonment or anything, I think, we want to capture that. I thought by incorporating what we had talked about is incorporating sort of that murder one while committing CSC language. That's part of the statute. That's the only registration requirement for the murder one while committing to or attempting to commit CSC. If we added language to false imprisonment, where if they were charged with that, attempting to or while attempting to commit CSC, same with kidnapping, that would be fine. Now, I realize in a lot of those situations, they'll probably be charged with CSC anyways.
yeah,
if they're
that's what
not-
it's talking about.
If they're not, I'm just thinking of rare circumstances where, let's say, there was actually just a case I just was reading that a guy was essentially stalking this house, looking at a 5-year-old girl that lived in this house for months, eventually broke into the house, grabbed her in her bedroom, did sexually assault her in the bedroom, and then was attempting to leave with her. And the mom ran into him and he fled the area. He was actually convicted of kidnapping and burglary out of that offense, but also charged with CSC, registrations in play. But let's say there wasn't, the motive wasn't clear, or the attempted kidnapping, or maybe there was some acknowledgement of his intent at some point, and you didn't have enough for the CSC charges to be a kidnapping while attempting to commit CSC, just as an example. Those are the kinds of cases we want to still incorporate in the mix, I think, right? It's just avoiding any non-sexually motivated offense.
Well, I don't really know how you do that unless you just get rid of them, Brian. And because, I mean, you kind of have to get into a whole kind of separate analysis then on the sexual motivation. I mean, if it's a kidnapping or false imprisonment, that's a sex offense where you have enough to charge a sex offense, they're already in there.
Yeah.
So that's what we had talked about, trying to do something more this way, taking it out of the same set of circumstances. I don't know that there's a way you're gonna completely get rid of sex offenders, nor do I know if that's what the legislature intended when they changed it to predatory offenders. It seems like they did that because they were keeping in some of the other types of offenses, but well, and you can look at the other language that, I mean, there was the other language that Troy worked on, but to me, that other language was kind of redundant because it brings in the 243, 166 offenses that already require registration for those offenses or same set of circumstances. So then that's why we talked about this might be a different way to get at that, but.
Karen?
Well, I don't want to interrupt the substantive discussion because I have no opinions on that. I just had some wordsmith ideas. If you get to this point, I just would say I don't know that it's worth repeating that they were charged with or petitioned for. You could just lead with that they were convicted of or adjudicated delinquent for, just to get some words out. And then also, I don't think you could be number 3 because there already are a 3 through 5. So then you run into the whole problem of renumbering that whole section or putting it at the end. That was it, just mechanics.
Yep.
Okay.
I also noted they kind of already repeat the same language for 1 and 2. You know, on the petition charge with, instead of having it just all listed under 1. So that language, the person was charged with petition for a violation of all this language. That first paragraph is the same, I think, for 1 and 2. Katie, do you have any idea why those are separated out?
I think it's different there because of the whole need to mention the same set of circumstances. You have to note that they were charged with it, but convicted of something else. So.
Right, but I was saying 1 and 2, am I missing something, or isn't that exact same introductory language? So
Oh yeah, 1 and 2 are identical. I have a feeling that's because of one of those changes over time. That it used to be there was a list of you had to be convicted of, and then over time, both 1 and 2 became same set of circumstances paragraphs. Yeah, I agree. If you really want to clean it up, combine those two. That's a whole other pile of work.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, Brian.
Nothing specific about the language here, but just backing it up to, I think the whole thing was initiated with a poll question that we thought was going to be the low-hanging fruit that ended up having a super long discussion last time, right? And was initiated by, I thought the majority of the group at least had said, can somebody repeat what the poll question was again? I thought it was something about non-sexually motivated false imprisonment, kidnapping, or related to domestic violence, drug, any other reason not sexual that we didn't want those folks to register. Or was there a way to not to have them avoid that? Because Angie, you mentioned, I don't know if the legislature, what their plan was with that, but in terms of our working group, what was the result of that, or what was the language there again? Everybody has it.
It was in the polling, it did talk about non-sexual, which was the largest support for the kidnapping and false imprisonment, exclude those. And then there were a few people who said just exclude all false imprisonments and kidnapping, but the majority said exclude kidnapping and false imprisonment if they didn't have a sexual aspect.
Okay, that's what I thought. All right.
Also, I think that's the language that Troy, the first language that Mark was putting up in the slides, he tried to rewrite that with false imprisonment. But I think the problem with that is, at least with how the language is, to me, it seems redundant because it's while committing. I mean, you can so that's what we had talked about. Is I just don't know how you make that determination separately from how it's kind of already made without then getting the courts into having to, make determinations somehow on whether something's sexually motivated. You know what I mean?
Jim?
Or-
Oh. There you are.
I mean, I know that we had agreed to like try to exclude the non-sexual, but when I went back to look at kidnapping and the whole host of horribles that encompass kidnapping, I just don't know that we could do a clean exclusion on some. I mean, I'd still be willing to look at it, but it's gonna, I mean, I'm still looking at it, it still requires quite a deep down. What I would say about this is I agree with Angie and the others that it's statute's redundant, which you could sort of take subdivision 1 and 2 and combine. But the other thing I want to point out is that what the subdivision 3 that's in red, essentially what it's going to promote doing is getting a conviction. So you've got a guy who's charged with a domestic with a false imprisonment. It's probably to avoid the false imprisonment, you're going to see more probably pleas to domestics to avoid going to trial on the false imprisonment. So in theory, what could happen under subdivision 3 that in red, you could be charged with, let's say, a domestic and then false imprisonment, go to trial, be acquitted on the domestic, and then be convicted of the false imprisonment. You'd have to register. Which I don't know that was what we intended to do, but in the same vein, I don't know who drafted it. It seems like the sheriff was involved and probably a prosecutor, but it seems to be leading to the domestic and then dropping the false imprisonment, which, I mean, if I can figure that out, I'm sure most defense lawyers will figure that out in 5 minutes. But I guess that's what I add to it. I'm not, I mean, it's a step in the right direction. I'm somewhat okay with it. I mean, it gives us a little bit something more. But those are my thoughts.
Brian.
I was just going to go back to the idea of the repetition again, Angie, when you talked about, if we had the false imprisonment while committing or attempting to commit CSC, they'd probably likely be charged with CSC already. Wouldn't that same thing likely happen in a murder 1? The registration clause right now says murder 1 while attempting to commit or CSC. Would they pretty much most likely be charged with also CSC 1 or something in those cases too? So that's my thought, is if we already have that, and that's probably going to be repetitive, what would be the harm in adding those pieces to false imprisonment and kidnapping? But again, just some thoughts.
That I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure sometimes or maybe often that happens. I think a lot of times with homicide cases, it's more of the higher counts that actually relate to the death. But no, I hear what you're saying. And maybe it's the way that it was written. I mean, maybe there's a way to write it differently, but I think, and again, Mark, I think Mark put this in the slides now, but that you had up earlier, but I think the way it was written, it was just basically bringing in 243-166. And I wasn't at the meeting when you guys were talking about this. So I had listened to it after the fact, or I probably would have at the time said, I don't know if this is going to accomplish what I think you guys want to accomplish. So, yeah, so maybe there's a way to write it. I think then you're going to put prosecutors in a position, if you can charge false imprisonment, or if you have to prove that extra element, they're going to just charge the false imprisonment, I would think, if they can't charge the criminal sex. But I don't know, but yeah, I think you would have to add a new false imprisonment while committing crim sex and see how it goes. But I just thought it sounded like it was going to be redundant from a registration standpoint.
Representative Moeller.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I don't know what some of the other groups are looking at, but if we're still worried about with this language casting our net too broadly and getting some of those domestics still, even if it's just the conviction for false imprisonment, I don't know what work is being done on the off ramps. Like, is that something that, you know, then somebody can try to get off or petition for or whatever. So I just wanted to put that out there because I know a lot of the things that we're talking about in this group is connected to and related to some of those other groups as well.
Jim, did you have your hand up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just on the homicide provision, it's difficult to sort of be able to sustain all the elements for a crim sex on a homicide when you have to show consent and the person who would say there was no consent is dead. I mean, I don't think you can say for sure that consent wasn't necessarily an issue. So what you have is the homicide with, you know, evidence of some type of sexual assault, but they don't have to prove that there was no consent. And I think that's how you got to that specific subdivision on murder. I mean, I could be wrong, but I'm sort of thinking that's sort of where that came from. So, you know, when you certainly on all the other provisions, so you have a false imprisonment that's not a registerable offense, but if you charge it with a criminal sexual conduct offense, it's going to be registerable out of the same set of circumstances language because of any crim sex that is registerable on it. What my concern is that, and I had this happen to me a number of times where I was involved in a case where we were sort of negotiating like a felony domestic or something along those lines, and then negotiations fell apart. We were going to go to trial, and then the prosecutor amends the complaint to include false imprisonment to get more leverage to try to get a plea. Is what I've had that happen to me a number of times, more so than, and that sort of brings up the, you know, really is this fair? So at least what's proposed in Troy's modification does away with that, from my standpoint.
And so Mark, why don't you pull up the false imprisonment language that Troy had that was in the first slide?
Okay.
This is the one that I initially, that kind of like we've talked about, and that Jim just said too. It seems to me that it's kind of redundant, but which is why we kind of went the other way and tried to figure out if there was another way to try to deal with some of the, you know, I mean, to me, a lot of the same set of circumstances cases that I've seen are domestic situations where they plead to the domestic assault and then they have to register. So they're not getting that conviction for the false imprisonment. So I think that would eliminate a lot of people from the registry, and not just domestics, like the drug offenses, the robberies. I mean, it's very common they're not convicted of that false imprisonment, at least in the ones that I've reviewed. So we were thinking, I think with the proposed language to take it out of the same set of circumstances, that would address a lot of those cases. But there's this other language that Troy, he did rewrite some of the false imprisonment language to try to address kind of what you were talking about last time. And that's this language. But my thinking on this was, you know, if they're charged with B, they're likely gonna be charged with committing or attempting to commit that registration offense, and then registration would be required anyway. And then I also was trying to think from a prosecutor's standpoint, if you can prove the confinement without proving that, you know, why wouldn't you just charge it easier one to prove and then charge the criminal sex? And then this is the one I think he did to maybe kind of make a separate thing for domestic assault. To maybe, so that maybe that would be exempted from the registration if they rewrote the false imprisonment and exempted that kind of charge.
Which is similar. This is the language in the murder. This is that exclusion for criminal sexual conduct again. But this would be just removing domestic assault, but leaving in drug crimes or other non-sexual associated crimes.
So maybe, you know, those might make more sense, Brian, as far as what you guys were talking about. It seems like maybe not be as. This is the one that I think is the least helpful.
Yeah, what was the next one, Mark, maybe? Was it the second one?
The next one was,
The third one, maybe.
well, this is, the third one is
There we go.
the one criminal sexual conduct that Angie was objecting to because it's kind of redundant, much like the murder one, but because murder is a higher level.
Yeah, the first one is the one I really thought was redundant. This one, in the same vein, it's gonna include the crim sex, presumably.
And then this is one that just excludes domestic assault, but there's been the recommendation to say to commit domestic assault, drug, or assault, which are probably the three crimes most associated with false imprisonment would be drug offenses, assault, including domestic assault.
Yeah, I would want to broaden it out of from just domestic assault then to exclude other things.
So, I mean, it could be, there could be some kind of, recommendation to amend the false imprisonment or the same circumstances, or both for that matter, I guess. And again, I know everyone's not on board, so I think Stacy and I had talked about doing a majority and minority kind of recommendation or position on them.
Jim.
Doesn't the, bear with me. Doesn't the one where we do the amending of not the false imprisonment statute, but the registration statute, eliminate the drug cases and the domestic cases or those other offenses where, let's say, false imprisonment is charged, but they're not convicted of false imprisonment? Doesn't that do what we? I mean, that seems to me to be the most. From looking at the three options, that seems to. It doesn't eliminate false imprisonment from registering only if you get convicted of it by way of either a trial or plea, but it certainly prevents the guy who gets the domestic or a drug offense, who is charged with the false imprisonment, who's convicted of the domestic or the false imprisonment or the drug offense, from having to register. Agree? I mean,
Yes.
You're talking
Okay.
about the first
Yes.
one?
I
Yeah.
think you're talking about the one currently up now,
yes,
which says
Yeah.
you have to actually be convicted of false imprisonment, whether it's sexually involved or not. But
right. And the
you
only
can't
ones that
just
would
be charged.
and the only ones that could foreseeably be on the registry are the ones that went to trial and lost and got convicted of the false imprisonment and the domestic and or the drug offense, you know what I'm saying? So it's still possible. But, you know, when you're looking at a trial rate of 2 and 3%, you know, I don't know how many that's going to be.
Jim, would you say in most of in your experience, if somebody's charged with false imprisonment and a domestic or false imprisonment and a drug offense, if they weren't required to register for same set of circumstances, they would be inclined to plead to the assault or the drug offense or whatever?
Well, it seems that this language is going to sort of put a factor in a position where you're sort of telling the client, look, if you go to trial on this and you lose, you're going to have to register. So let's just take our lumps on the drugs or whatever so we can avoid the registration, or maybe, you know, we could do something more on sentencing, or there's, you know, you could go down from a felony domestic to a gross misdemeanor domestic and still get a plea that isn't as onerous, but you still avoid the registration component. Where if it's charged and it's under the same set of circumstances, you're going to trial. Now, from a practitioner standpoint, you know, and I could have prosecutors might disagree with me on this. This is one of these just subjective assessments. Juries have a hard time understanding false imprisonment because they think of it in terms of kidnapping, and the language is really sort of way much softer. And I think it's harder to get convictions on those when you go to trial because it's just the language is so nuanced, and it's in contrast to kidnapping. And jurors' mindsets are kidnapping versus false, you know, what we statutorily understand to be false imprisonment. So, you know, that's a discussion that's really beyond the pale of this, what we're trying to do here. But, I mean, that goes just trying to make an assessment about what are your chances if you're going to get convicted of a false imprisonment if you went to trial. I think that's beyond what we're trying to do here.
And what about the language that separates out domestic assault in the false imprisonment? Do you think that is helpful, or that would be helpful?
It's helpful, but it's just narrow. It's just very narrow. Assuming
if that included drug offenses and assault.
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly help, and certainly makes it much clearer what the intention is, as long as you put in, I mean, and would it be your intention then to make sure you amended the registration statute to include
Right.
that intention as well?
Yeah, I think that would be the idea, is then the registration statute would be false imprisonment under subdivision 2A and C or something.
Okay. I certainly would support that.
Brian, how about you? Does that more address what you've been thinking about?
I think, you know, when you've been talking about, you sit down for a plea agreement and yeah, the lawyer's going to talk to the guy and say, if you take this false imprisonment plea, you're going to have to register. If you take domestic assault, drugs, anything else, you don't. Well, that seems pretty obvious. what the decision is going to be. So if they're not, if we require a conviction for false imprisonment, and most guys are not going to, take that plea, Jim said, what, 2 to 3% trial rate. So you're taking your chance. It's going to be a small number that actually gets convicted of it. If that's how it's going to go in all practical purposes, I think that is helpful. It'll rule out a lot of the non-sex guys for sure. Yeah. I'm still down for that language with the attempting to commit and sex stuff, but this is no, this sounds good too.
That's all I have for today.
Okay.
Mark and Olivia, do you guys have anything?
Janine. Whoops.
Thanks. I just wanted to take just a second. I think Stacy still isn't here. I heard that she wasn't.
She's
make
not.
To call out that email that she sent out about Connecticut and Connecticut looking at the registry. I didn't look at it super closely, but at a glance, it was really quite compelling. It looks like they are identifying similar challenges that our subgroups and our larger task force committee has identified. And they are clearly a work in progress. They have a subcommittee, as I understand it, going on. I suspect those committee notes are public. And they haven't nailed down, I don't think, a recommendation, but in the editorial, it does reference that that Connecticut is the only one of states out there. All the other states have gone to risk-based registry. So it was super timely, I thought, that Stacy sent that out, and it just happens to be occurring in another state. Not that we want to do everything like Connecticut. But they have 5,700 guys, and they're saying, or people on their registry, and they're saying that is unmanageable. So I thought, whoa, BCA might take issue with that if they want to see really something that's unmanageable, but or challenging to manage. So anyway, I'm really a believer of trying not to recreate the wheel if we don't have to. And this may be for future conversation, because I know we also had talked about the challenge of the time limitedness of this group intervention. But it may be worth it to, I don't know, reach out to someone there. I don't know anyone. I don't know the names of anyone on that committee. I may or may not know someone in that area, but just wanted to highlight that. I thought it was a super timely email and worth a read.
And if you didn't see that, I think the comment that Janine was referring to is the proposal recently made to the Sentencing Commission. But you all have that, so let's. Brian.
I was just going to say in response to Janine and then Representative Muller about the off-ramp situation. So the subgroup with Stacy and Renee and I are looking into, we got a list of all the states and their sort of current off-ramp, like Connecticut, she sent that out, but we got all 50 states in terms of what they're doing for petition to get off the registry as juveniles, as adults. Some have it, some don't. Renee and I are going to look into that a little bit more. We may be presenting some of that information tomorrow to the methods subgroup, depending on how much time we have, and we can get through all that information. But at some point, we'll be digging deeper into that piece of it.
So Angie.
And I was just going to say, I forgot to mention that this morning, but I do possibly have the ability to get a law clerk on this if there are other things we need to find out about other states that we're interested in. So let me know if I haven't had a chance to go through all the Connecticut information, but it's possible I could get. I know, Brian, that Stacy mentioned it would be nice if she had a law clerk to deal with, the off-ramp issues. I mean, it's possible if it would be helpful that I could get someone to look, do a survey of who has the off-ramps, what they look like, whatever, or maybe you guys have already done that. So just let me know if that's something that would be helpful.
Let me Hang on a second. I was just gonna say, I'll try to pull up this website that Stacy sent, and maybe just share it real quick after Representative O'Neill speaks here to
But
see if
if-
this is what we're talking about.
But just one thing to say on that is combining forces on that might not be a bad idea if, Angie, you did have somebody who could assist in this, so then they could coordinate that information. But I'm sure that law clerk assistance would be welcomed.
Yeah, I
Or
mean,
I hope,
I just didn't fill out the form. I was told that I could probably get some help, but I didn't fill out the form because I didn't want to be doing redundant work. Like even on the juveniles, we have some juvenile information, we have general information on what states require or what the statutes are. But I just thought it might be helpful to somehow, get the specific issues we're looking at kind of together in one place.
Representative O'Neill.
Thanks. So one thing we haven't really discussed, I would kind of put out to the group to think about is when we were having the conversations about juveniles and the stay of adjudication option, the legislature extended the stay of adjudication from 6 months to 1 year around 2010 or 11, somewhere in that time frame. And we certainly could look at extending it to another 18 months because as we were discussing this, the conversation was that sometimes treatment takes 18 months. And so it's not quite as, 1 year isn't quite enough time. So that might be an option. I know we've talked about a lot of different options, but that option didn't kind of percolate to the top or even to be discussed. So I thought I would just put that out that the legislature has extended it from 6 months to a year already. And we certainly could look at extending it to a full 18 months so that treatment could be completed and they could have a fair shake at it.
Jim.
I don't have a comment.
Katrina.
No, I was just gonna say, appreciate that being brought up, Representative O'Neill. I know that County Attorney Baker's brought this up as well, and so he may be somebody we want to loop into this conversation specific to the stay of adjudication, because I know that he did bring it up, I think, in his first attendance at a work group meeting. So just want to have that on our radar as well.
Brian.
You want me to just try to share this document really quick? It's called the 50 state comparison relief from sex offense registration obligations. Just to see if we're not reinventing the wheel too much, or somebody could, this is what Renee and I were going to do a deeper dive in. Can people see that?
Yes.
So you got Alabama here at the top, duration of registration requirement, early termination generally, early termination juvenile, eligibility, some of that. So then it goes state by state, talks about what they're doing now and really breaks down everything. So let's see, that Connecticut information is right here.
So do we have this?
Stacy sent it to Renee and I don't know if we had the full group where, again, this was maybe subgroup only at that point, but I don't see why we shouldn't just send it to everyone. And if law clerks or, I don't have a law clerk, but if somebody wants to do a deeper dive into this, and from a time perspective, they can. Otherwise, Renee and I will do sort of a brief, maybe 30,000 foot flyover version, a little bit for tomorrow's group.
And yeah, Brian, if you can share that so we can put it on the webpage.
I'll email it over to you. Yep, and Olivia.
Yeah, then I can look and see if it's, if there's, maybe talk to you guys about if there's anything additional that a law clerk could add to that.
Sounds good.
Anything else there? Just in case there's any public comment, feel free now to raise your hand as we're approaching the end here. So if anybody from the public would like to make any statement or comment, feel free to raise your hand. anything else from our last remaining chair here?
I have nothing else. I'm not the last remaining chair. I'm the only chair.
Okay,
But I have
yeah.
time to make up because I missed a couple last week, so, or the week before.
I think they did that on purpose, maybe.
I know, I'm thinking, I had good excuses. I was hiking.
Olivia, did you have anything else here?
Nope. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
And I was just gonna say, I know that I feel like we're sort of just kind of keep kind of floundering along, but I'll talk with Troy and Stacy at the next co-chair meeting, and I'm thinking maybe we should at least kind of get sort of a draft started of something that ultimately will be a report that we can maybe get the main issues from each group kind of in one place, and give us something as a group to work off of going forward. So I'll suggest that when we have the co-chair meeting.
Absolutely. Anything
All right,
else?
thanks everyone.
Oh, Representative O'Neill.
Just a question about scheduling. Are we doing the subgroup meetings every other week now, or was that just, we had taken a few weeks off? What's the schedule, Mark?
Right now it's every other week. It was sort of being reserved just in case. It's not scheduled. It will be canceled for next week also, so that we only have the group meeting. And we also have that ending of the subgroups, that next week or 2 weeks from now would be the last scheduled subgroup meetings. Again, that can be extended for 1 or 2 or all 3 of them if additional ones. So.
Yeah, and that's something we should put on the agenda for the co-chairs to figure out that part of it.
And I think that question about sort of now putting everything into a framework to look at what has been covered and discussed is a good idea.
Okay.
And Katie.
Can we then send out a cancellation for those meetings next week to clear up our calendars, or just we're for sure not having them? I mean, with Representative O'Neill, as we look ahead into the next week. We're not. Okay, thank you.
And Karen.
Sorry, I missed that. Was there a question for me?
Oh, sorry. I thought I saw your hand up.
Nope.
You probably
If I did, it was an accident. Sorry.
Okay.
All right,
Anything
thanks
else?
everyone. Nope.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Have a good
See you
day,
later. Have a
everyone.
good day.
Bye.